Antichrist by Lars Von Trier is one of the most brutal films I've ever seen. Its extremely graphic depictions of violence and sex are some of the most obscene things I've ever laid my eyes on. Wait a minute, I can't even say that these are depictions, can I? Because, the sex in the film is real. Regardless, it's a film that's not for the faint of heart. That being said, my heart hasn't fainted since that one time at Grandma's last summer that my family has sworn to never mention again, so I loved it. Despite all of its extreme and gratuitous violence, I think Antichrist is super intriguing. There's so many hidden layers to pull back, it's almost sort of intimidating to try to condense my thoughts into this analysis. What do I talk about? Just about every frame of the movie can be taken allegorically, and there are about 101 different things you could discuss. Faced with this problem, I asked myself, what is the most problematic thing about this film? And then I asked, how can I defend that? One could argue that Lars Von Trier himself is probably the most problematic thing about this film, since his personality is oftentimes off-putting to say the least, and he's made some very questionable comments about Adolf Hitler. And not the chill kind of Hitler talk that you do with your friends halfway through the beer pong game, but that awkward, sort of unprovoked kind of Hitler talk that goes a little something like this. Hi sir, welcome to Chili's. Will it just be you tonight?
Have I ever told you my thoughts on the Third Reich?
No. Is the booth okay?
That depends. Do you think the annihilation of a worthless race is okay?
Let me get my manager. He's a piece of work for sure, but I agree with Von Trier on one thing. Antichrist, at its core, is actually a feminist film. Now I know, how could a film that quite literally makes claims that women are evil and has its main character become a raging psychopath possibly be a feminist film? The answer lies in the subtext. Antichrist is a film that begs you to pay attention to every single frame of it. Nearly every shot has some type of significance to help you understand the story and its themes. Religion, patriarchal systems, and the pain of maternity all play into what I think is probably the most feminist, anti-feminist film ever made. So let's dive into that. So what even is feminism, and how does it apply to a movie titled Antichrist of all things? Feminism is essentially the advocacy of women's rights as being equal to men. However, I think this film is more or less a representation of women's liberation, being the act of women breaking free from their subservient status and ultimately the patriarchal system. Women's liberation and feminism kind of go hand in hand in the 21st century though, so I'll more than likely use these two terms interchangeably. Antichrist, first and foremost, is the story of he and she. That isn't me being funny, those are quite literally their names. And after the unexpected death of their son, she begins to have vicious cycles of grief, panic attacks, and violent outbursts. He is a therapist and deduces that the best thing for she is to go back to the cabin in the forest called Eden, I know, pretty on the nose, right, and face her fears head on. They return to this cabin where she was writing her thesis on women's oppression, spooky happenings occur, and now we have a movie. And before I continue, let me just say, there are so many layers to this film, and I just highly advise you all to just go and watch it and try to piece these things together yourself, because it's really impossible for me to just address everything in such a short time frame. But that being said, I mentioned that she was writing a thesis. She's thesis is called Gynocide, and it's about the inherent torture and oppression of women throughout the course of human history. It chronicles a bunch of historic events, but the one that is most relevant to our conversation is the Salem witch trials. For those who aren't aware, the Salem witch trials were a point during the 17th century where women were hunted and burned alive at the stake for suspicion of being a witch. From our modern understanding, we can infer that no women were actually witches, or at least I hope, but any women who displayed any signs of high intelligence, dexterity, or cunning were deemed possessed by the devil and immediately killed. This sort of forced women into sort of a subservient patriarchal system that essentially just punished women for showing signs of brilliance. Sounds familiar, right? But through the process of writing her thesis, she has a change of heart and basically does a 180 and says, you know what, they kind of deserved it. We're freaking evil creatures who deserve to be oppressed. Now I know what you're all thinking. How in the hell is this still a feminist movie if the women character is portrayed this way? And for that I'd like to retort that messaging is all dependent on the speaker. We have to understand the perspective and the way in which we receive information, and that determines how we feel about any particular message. It being election season, I'm sure you all are very familiar with this notion. With that information, I'd like to point out that the entire film is told primarily through the perspective of he. We spend more time with him, he's portrayed as the rational thinker of the two, and we experience all of she and Eden with him. Understanding what I just mentioned about the Salem witch trials, she only begins to lose her sanity when he discovers her thesis and reads it. This is supposed to directly parallel the experience of women in the 17th century. Through the eyes of he, she is displaying intelligence, and that is inherently evil, or at least according to a male-dominated 17th century. These patriarchal systems have leaked into today's governmental policies, and that's why this film portrays it in the way that it does. You're supposed to watch this film and have problems with its representation of women, because he is an unreliable narrator, and his biased preconception of what she is rooted in centuries long of egotistical men oppressing and killing women. Gynocide, if you will. Later in the film, when she bashes he's genitals with a block, although extraordinarily graphic, consider what this moment actually means in the grand scheme of things. She's uprising and defending herself is quite literally emasculating he, taking away his identity as a man, his genitals. But after this, she still feels the need to pleasure he, and he ejaculates blood. But even after taking the power away from him and asserting herself, she still feels the need to be subservient to him at this moment, and his blood being ejaculated is a visual metaphor for all the bloodshed of women throughout history, women who were oppressed by the phallus, by the man. Eventually, he strangles she to death, which can be seen as a metaphor for the silencing of women's voices throughout history. But you would think it would end there, and that was it. But no, the movie pushes it even further and has he burn she at a stake. If the comparisons to the witch trials weren't enough already, they are now. He watches she burn at the stake and then tracks back through the woods of Eden. And as he walks, millions of women begin to emerge from the trees in the woods to gather around he. All of their faces are blurred, and he is the only person who can be recognized. These women are the fallen women of history, whose stories will never be told. Their faces are forgotten, but despite all of them, the one person to triumph and be remembered is he. And with that, this film is over. There's so much to talk about in this film, and it kind of hurts my heart that I can't just make this 45 minutes long and just talk about everything that I noticed. I didn't even talk about how the woods are literally called Eden, and that Eve is inherently responsible for the fall of Eden in biblical texts, and that God is considered to be a male presence that created the universe that Eve supposedly destroyed by listening to another male presence in that of Satan, and just, But yeah, Antichrist has tons of other themes to dissect, themes like maternity, grief, religion, nature, mental illness, etc. And so for those reasons, I highly advise that you just go and watch it for yourself to truly understand and just dissect this film on your own terms. But with that, Antichrist is actually a film about the oppression of women. It's a women's story told through an anti-women's perspective, through a man's perspective. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to avoid camping in dark and spooky forests known for their biblical references. Thank you.